The air trembled with the scent of dry grass. On a plain where the horizon never ended, the wind carried dust and tension. And then it came. A bolt of lightning ripped the sky open, slamming into a patch of brittle grass and birthing something no one in the group had ever seen before. Fire. It wasn't just light. It wasn't just heat. It was alive, dancing, crackling, hissing like a predator. The group froze. Some shrank back, others stared. The flames grew rapidly, hungrily consuming the yellowed field, painting the night in violent orange. They had no word for it, no understanding, only reaction. And that reaction was fear. They ran. Days passed. The fire died. The blackened earth was left behind, a scorched scar in the middle of their world. But something pulled one of them back. A young male, curious and thin, crept close to where the fire had once raged. The ground was still warm. Ash drifted like snow. In the center, among the bones of burned branches, glowed a faint, pulsing ember. Red, soft, and breathing. He didn't run this time. He crouched. Something stirred in him. Not quite recognition, but possibility. He reached out, then hesitated. The ember shimmered brighter, as if responding. Slowly he scooped it up with a piece of bark, trembling as the heat nipped his skin. The bark held. The ember lived. When he returned to the group, they circled him, suspicious, distant. But the glow drew them in. Night had always meant cold, predators hiding in silence. But this thing pushed back the dark. It lit their faces, their hands, their eyes. The old ones kept their distance. The mothers pulled their children close. But the fire, it stayed. Then they watched. It wasn't long before someone realized the animals didn't come close anymore. The strange light scared them off. They slept a little better that night. Not deep, not without fear, but better. Then came the discovery that would change everything. Someone dropped a hunk of scavenged meat near the fire. It sizzled, turned dark, even black. The smell hit them. Rich, different, almost sweet. One of the youngest, perhaps out of hunger or sheer boldness, picked it up and chewed. Their eyes widened. It was easier to bite, easier to swallow. Others followed. The meat tasted different, better. Something was happening, and they didn't know why, but they knew they liked it. The fire was no longer just protection. It was transformation. They began to sit closer. They fed it small twigs, dry leaves, old bones. They watched how it reacted. The crackle, the sparks, the glow. Each movement of the flame became a kind of language, a rhythm. Over time, the fire became the center of their nights, not the stars, not the trees. But this crackling, hissing, whispering thing that made shadows dance on their faces and told stories without words. It was no longer fear that defined them. It was fire. The flames danced low in the cradle of bark, their breath flickering weak but steady. Round them, the tribe huddled in a semicircle, silent, wide-eyed, reverent. They had no words for what they were witnessing, only the shared recognition of something profound. The girl, now no longer just a daughter or forager, had become something more. She was the keeper of fire, and unknowingly the bearer of a revolution. The meat she had laid near the ember was now sizzling. Fat dripped onto the stone, hissing as it met the heat. One of the younger males leaned forward, nose twitching. The smell was intoxicating, different from the raw, bloody scent of fresh kills. This was something deeper, more complex, smoky, rich, inviting. She motioned with her hand as if to say, "Try it." Slowly, cautiously, he reached for the piece and bit down. His eyes widened, his chewing slowed. Then came a nod, hesitant at first, then more confident. Others followed, one by one, sampling the strange new transformation of flesh. In that moment, fire had done more than cook meat. It had softened suspicion, united hunger, and ignited a new layer of trust. That night, they didn't wander. They stayed put, building a circle of stones, feeding the embers with dry twigs and leaves. They shared the roasted remains of the thun lain and whatever small animals they had scavenged that day. Conversation, such as it was, took the form of gestures, mimicry, and guttural sounds. But something had shifted. They were no longer just surviving side by side. They were eating together. Fire changed more than their food. It changed how they looked at each other, began gathering closer, leaning into the warmth, their faces illuminated in orange glow, shadows dancing on their skin. Where once they had gone to sleep early to avoid the cold and the predators, they now stayed awake longer. They watched. They mimed. They grunted soft stories of hunts and narrow escapes. The fire was not just fuel, it was a stage. The old man, the one who first tasted the lightning-roasted meat, began bringing small bones to the fire, cracking them open, letting the marrow drip onto hot stones. The smell drew interest. He used a rock to mash roasted roots into soft paste. Someone brought leaves, wrapping bits of meat inside like crude packages. They were experimenting, not out of boredom, but curiosity. The tribe, once reactive and ruled by fear, was beginning to act with intention. But fire was not easily tamed. Twice they let it die, the embers smothered by rain or carelessness. Each time, it brought panic. How would they cook? How would they stay warm? Predators still circled the night, drawn to the smell of cooked meat. Without fire, they were vulnerable again, so they learned. A younger boy, barely walking age, sat watching the girl and the old man feed twigs into the fire. He imitated them, finding dried grass, blowing on faint coals. He learned to recognize the crack sound that meant wood was dry enough. Fire was no longer a miracle, it was a craft. Days blurred into weeks. The tribe moved as nomads always did, following the herds, seeking water. But now something was different. They carried the fire with them, tucked inside a hollowed-out gourd or bundled in bark and moss. Always watched. Always tended. Like a fragile heartbeat, the ember was kept alive through storms, hunger, and exhaustion, and with it came ritual. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the treetops, someone, sometimes the girl, sometimes the old man, sometimes a wide-eyed child, would feed the ember, coax it to flame, and place it at the center of camp. The others would gather, almost instinctively, forming the same half-circle. Some chewed, others carved. A few just stared into the flickering orange, but the fire was always central. And then one night it happened. The young hunter returned, limping, his shoulder torn open by a predator's claw. He collapsed near the fire, groaning. The tribe moved around him, unsure. Blood flowed freely. The girl, now older and calmer in presence, took a sharpened stick and placed it into the flames. She waited. The tip glowed red. Without hesitation, she pressed it into the wound. The scream pierced the trees, and for a moment all froze. But the bleeding slowed. The wound blackened. And the boy, while shaking, breathed easier. Fire, once feared as a destroyer, had now healed. By then, the meaning of the flame had evolved beyond warmth or food. It was now a guardian, a tool, a weapon, a healer, and perhaps above all, a symbol. Those who could keep it alive were valued. Those who understood it were listened to, and those who feared it began to respect it. In the eyes of the wild, fire made these fragile beings something else, not beasts, not prey, but something new, something becoming. Their world was still dangerous. Death still lurked in shadows. But around that tiny flickering flame, they had carved out the first fragile border between the wild and the human. And from that border, something far greater was preparing to emerge. The journey pressed onward. The ember cradled in bark, or cupped within cooled stones, remained the tribe's most sacred possession, more vital than spears, more precious than waterskins. It was passed between hands with silent care, as if everyone understood its weight wasn't just physical but ancestral. This fire, born from a lightning strike and nursed through trial and instinct, now defined who they were becoming. Each night, when the sun fell and the jungle thickened into darkness, they did the same thing. They gathered, fed the ember, and watched as it swelled into flame. It was no longer fear that drew them to the fire. It was identity. It was around the fire that they began to organize. What once had been chaotic gatherings now held shape. Those who hunted sat with those who gathered. Those who protected sat beside the young. Eyes met. Hands gestured with clarity. The simple act of eating together face to face, illuminated by flame, gave rise to something unseen before. A rudimentary hierarchy. It's not of domination, but of function. One older woman began to sit at the center, near the flames. Not because she demanded it, but because others gave her that space. She had memory. She remembered which root caused stomach pain and which healed. She recalled where the river bent and where the predators waited. She was not the fastest. She was not the strongest. But she had stories. And around the fire, stories became tools as useful as spears. Children began mimicking her hand motions, echoing her grunts and expressions, rehearsing her tales with clumsy enthusiasm. The fire became not just warmth or light, but a stage, a classroom, a cradle for language itself, as the effect of fire on their minds was subtle but profound. Bellies full of cooked food meant less energy spent on digestion, more energy for thought. Less time chewing, more time communicating. Their faces changed, their jaws narrowed. Their brains, slowly, imperceptibly, began to grow. And with it, imagination took root. One boy began collecting rocks, not for smashing, but for shaping. He struck one against another, not for function, but for symmetry. A girl began to arrange feathers and leaves in specific patterns. Someone smeared ash across their face and laughed. These weren't accidents. These were ideas. Fire wasn't just changing how they lived, it was changing why they lived. Danger still loomed. Predators still prowled. The world was no less brutal. But around the fire, they made sense of it. When one of their own was lost, dragged by a beast in the night, or swept away by river, they gathered not in silence, but in remembrance. One night they placed a piece of cooked meat on a flat stone facing the darkness, and left it there. A gift? Goodbye? No one said, but no one moved it. Fire had allowed them to dream, and from dreams came meaning. Even the act of migration changed. Where once they followed blindly, now they moved with intention. They marked trees with charred sticks. They remembered which caves echoed the best. They noted which stones sparked when struck together. The ember was no longer just carried. It was protected, even replicated. One woman, curious and relentless, learned that two particular rocks, struck the right way, could birth a spark. It was unpredictable, stubborn, but possible. When that first man-made spark caught dry moss and grew into flame, the tribe didn't cheer. They stared, in awe. Not because fire had returned, but because for the first time they had called it forth. They were no longer just its caretakers. They were its creators. That night they didn't sleep. They danced. Not with rhythm or reason, but with movement, expression, sound. Feet pounded dirt. Hands slapped thighs. Ash rose into the air as if in response. For the first time in millions of years, life was not just about surviving from one day to the next. It was about belonging to something more. The embers of that fire, not the physical ones, but the ones burning inside their shared memory, would be carried for generations. Passed from mother to son, from hunter to elder, from forgotten ancestor to dreaming child. It would ignite every future village, every story, every leap in thought, every whispered myth. And when, thousands of years later, someone would sit beside a campfire and watch the flames twist and dance in the night, they would feel it too. That same ancient pulse, that quiet, enduring truth, that fire didn't just cook our food, it cooked our minds. And in doing so, it lit the path from beast to human.